The content on the Untold Tales channel is protected by copyright. Unauthorized use may result in legal liability. That evening, I expected nothing more than a normal return home. But, as always, life throws surprises at you, and sometimes they become the final blow to the world you've carefully built over the years. When I entered the house, the silence immediately put me on edge. Normally, as soon as I open the door, her voice, the voice of my wife, Lisa, fills the space. She always greets me with a smile and a quick, "You're back." But today, nothing. Just silence. I hung my coat, set my bag by the door, and headed into the living room. My heart clenched in my chest when I saw her. Lisa was sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on one point, not looking at me. In her hands was her phone, which she quickly hid as soon as I entered. I felt something was wrong. "Lisa, are you okay?" I asked, trying not to let the anxiety show in my voice. She raised her gaze, but its coldness lacked the warmth that always calmed me. I sat down beside her, and her silence became a heavy burden I couldn't lift. "I'm fine," she answered quietly, but I knew something was off. I felt that something was stirring inside me, the instinct that I had lived with for all these years. Something wasn't right. I took her hand, and she didn't pull it away, but she didn't respond either. In that moment, thousands of thoughts raced through my mind, and reality began to feel distorted. I knew something was hidden, but I couldn't figure out what. "Are you hiding something from me, Lisa?" I said barely above a whisper, but my words hung in the air. She didn't answer immediately, as if she was deciding whether or not to reveal the truth. And suddenly, something familiar flickered in her eyes. Fear? But no, it wasn't just concern, it was something much deeper. I knew I wouldn't remain calm until I saw the truth. "Where's David?" I asked, knowing our son was at home because we always did our best to have dinner together. But she stayed silent. I couldn't hide it any longer. I took her phone, and despite her protests, opened the messages. The first thing I saw hit me like a punch. The name on the screen, Dmitry Koval. I knew this man. He was her colleague, and now, as I understood, much more. First shock, then anger. He had sent her photos that left no room for doubt. I suddenly realized that she wasn't just infatuated with this man, but doing everything to advance her career with his help. These relationships weren't random. Dmitry was her springboard, and I, just a convenient backdrop for her career. I felt a lump in my throat that became nearly unbearable. My fingers clenched the phone, and I restrained myself from throwing it against the wall. Instead, I stood up and stepped into a corner. "Are you cheating on me, Lisa?" I couldn't believe what I was saying. Anger, pain, and disappointment merged into one. She stayed silent. Long seconds stretched, like hours. Finally, she stood up from the couch and looked me in the eye. It was the look I had been trying to understand for so long. It was full of guilt, but also fear. I saw her trying to justify herself, but her words got stuck in her throat. "I didn't know how to tell you." Her voice was quiet, but I heard every word like a stab to my heart. It wasn't easy. He was my support. You know how hard it's been at work these past few months. How many times had I heard that phrase? How many times had she justified her silence by referring to work, to the difficulties of life? But now I knew. I was no longer first. Everything I had built, everything we had gone through, was now in gray ruins. And all for what? For career growth. For herself. I felt something inside me break. Lisa, the wife I had loved, the woman I had been through so much with. Now she was part of this lie. I had to restore justice. I had to protect myself and my family. "You're cheating on me, and I can't forgive this," I said, my voice growing more confident. Her eyes filled with tears, but it didn't matter anymore. At that moment, I needed to do something. Something that would let me regain my strength and take back what was rightfully mine. I knew my revenge would be harsh, but it was inevitable. The silence in the house became suffocating. Every word I spoke, every glance, like a bullet piercing the armor I had built over the years to protect my heart from disappointments. But here it was, the truth I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Lisa stood before me, her face twisted with pain and remorse. But no matter what she said, I felt only one thing. I could no longer love her. It was impossible. "You don't understand." Her voice trembled, as did her hands. "It wasn't like you think. I didn't want to. I just wanted to help. You know how hard I tried to make everything perfect." But I heard how her words became empty, meaningless. I didn't know which was worse, her betrayal or how she justified her actions. How she tried to convince me that everything was for us, for the family. We had built this life for so long, and now, all of it had collapsed in an instant. There was no sincerity in her words, only excuses. I turned toward the door, knowing what needed to be done. My life was no longer what I knew it to be. My hands clenched into fists, and my eyes filled with such rage that they became almost numb to the pain. I had to act. "Where is he?" I said through clenched teeth, not looking back at her. I knew I wouldn't get an answer I liked, but I didn't want to hear her. I just wanted to know one thing. Where was he? "Dimitri, he's not here." "He left," Lisa answered, her voice sounding strange, as if she was still trying to convince me to believe her. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. She couldn't hide from me. I knew this guy was still somewhere nearby. I had enough resources to find him if I wanted to. I stepped toward the door, and Lisa stood up, but I didn't listen to her. I walked into the hallway, my gaze darting to my things. I passed the bag where I had left my phone and took the car keys. All I needed was to find him. The time for revenge had come. It was dark outside, and the sky looked like a black veil. I got behind the wheel and immediately started the engine. The car roared like a beast ready for battle as I drove through empty streets. My thoughts were clearer than ever. Every turn of the wheel, every step I took, felt like a step toward justice. I had never forgiven traitors, and I wasn't going to let this man walk away without consequences. 20 minutes passed, and I was approaching the old warehouse where I knew I could find him. Dimitri was smart. He always picked hidden places, but I knew where to look. At this moment, I didn't want to think about the consequences. I just wanted to take back everything that had been taken from me. I got out of the car, making no unnecessary movements. My gaze was focused like a predator's before the attack. A weapon? I didn't need one. I had my experience, my hands, my anger, and I knew that was enough. When I opened the warehouse door, I immediately felt his presence. He was here. I could feel it with my whole body. He was somewhere out there, and he knew I was coming. "Dimitri." My voice echoed in the emptiness. The time has come. There was no surprise on his face. He knew I would find him, but that didn't matter. He had decided he could take everything that was mine. But he was wrong. He didn't know who he was dealing with. Dimitri stepped out of the shadows, his face emotionless, but I saw his hand slip toward his pocket. I knew he was ready too, but I was faster. I rushed at him, not giving him time to react. He didn't even manage to pull out his gun before I was right next to him, and my hands tightened around his throat. His body resisted, but I knew how to win. All I needed was to prove to him that I was stronger. "You thought you could just take everything?" I whispered in his face. "You thought you could get away with it?" His eyes filled with fear. He tried to fight back, but I squeezed with every movement. He wasn't my equal. I knew that. Then I let him go, forcing him to collapse to his knees. I stood in front of him, looking at his face, which was still twisted with pain, and said, "You will do what I say. Otherwise, there will be no place for you in this world. I will take everything you hold dear. And you? You'll be nothing but a shadow of your own actions." He stayed silent. The silence was the most terrifying punishment, and I knew that at that moment, everything had changed. I left him there, and without a word, I walked out, returning to the empty, cold house. Revenge was sweet, but something inside me still felt empty. Now, everything was decided. I didn't know what I would feel after leaving the warehouse and leaving him lying there in the dust. Is it possible to feel relief after destroying everything that was once part of your life? Does revenge ever bring satisfaction? I walked to the car with the feeling that something hadn't been completed, that my victory was false, that I had simply backed myself into a corner. Dimitri had been punished, but it wasn't enough. The sense of justice hadn't returned, as I thought it would. It remained somewhere between us, hanging in the air, not letting go. I returned home, just as I promised myself. The car glided silently through the dark streets, illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. The same question kept spinning in my head. What will I do now? How do I live with all this? There are always consequences in life, even when you try to ignore them. Entering the house, I felt the emptiness engulf me once again. Lisa was still sitting in the same living room. I stopped by the door, unsure of what to do. Her gaze was strange. It seemed like she was waiting for something, but couldn't understand what. Maybe she thought I would return to her, and everything would be as it was before, but I knew that was impossible. My heart was no longer what it had been before. "You did it," she said, not lifting her head. "You did it, and now you won't be able to forget. You think everything will be okay, but it won't." I didn't know how to respond. There was no pity or guilt in her voice, only dry acknowledgement, as though she had accepted the fact that everything between us was gone. "I thought you deserved this," I said. But inside, something clicked. "You wanted this, Lisa. You sacrificed everything for your own gain. You left me to live with him. And now you sit here and tell me I won't be able to forget? You're wrong." I turned and walked to the office. I turned on the light and opened the desk drawer where I kept the documents. One of them caught my attention, a letter I had never noticed before. It was from one of my old friends who worked in intelligence. He wrote that he had found something suspicious about Dmitri and his business. I read his words, and the world turned upside down again. Dmitri has connections with some major players. He's not just a businessman. He goes further. If you want to know what's hidden, you need to be ready for the fact that you're not just touching him, but much bigger forces. What did this mean? It wasn't just about personal revenge. It was part of a much bigger game. I hadn't just destroyed one person. I had touched a whole network that could not only ruin my life, but also the lives of those I cared about. I felt the tension build, and a lump formed in my chest. I decided to act, but now I understood that the game wouldn't be just with Dmitri. It would be with the system, with the forces that controlled everything, even things I hadn't realized. Lisa walked into the office, and I stood up. I had to make a decision. "Are you okay?" she asked, but I knew she wasn't looking for an answer. Her face was anxious, but this time, I felt it wasn't fear for me. It was something else, something deeper. "I can't come back to you, Lisa," I said, not lifting my gaze. "You've destroyed everything between us, and I can't live with it. But this isn't the end. I'm not stopping here. I have to understand what else is hidden behind all this." Her eyes filled with tears, but I could no longer pity her. She had already made her choice, and now I had to make mine. That night, I didn't sleep. My thoughts trailed off at every step, and I knew I was heading into a war not only with Dmitri, but with the system behind him. I was no longer the man who could sit quietly and accept injustice. I was the man who would fight, who would seek answers, who would destroy everything that threatened those I loved. The next morning, I drove to the old archive I had used for investigations in my past life. I searched for traces, documents, anything that might lead me to who was behind Dmitri. And I found what I was looking for: contact lists, classified deals, names I knew but hadn't thought might be connected. I was on the verge of a great revelation, and I knew I couldn't stop now. The injustices I was uncovering were becoming darker and more dangerous. Lisa was wrong if she thought I had forgotten. The game had only just begun. When I woke up in the morning, the world was no longer the one I had known. I was pulled into something bigger than personal revenge. Dmitri Korolev, this businessman with a faceless demeanor, turned out to be just a pawn in a huge game that I hadn't even realized the scale of. But now I knew one thing: I wasn't just driven by personal grievance, but by far more powerful forces that wouldn't stop until they completely destroyed me. I sat at the table, carefully studying the documents I had found in the archive. Each one was important. Every piece of information led to the next clue, the next point that might explain who was behind all these years of manipulation. I didn't know where this would take me, but one thing was clear: I couldn't go back. Suddenly, the phone rang. I immediately knew it couldn't be a random call. I picked up the receiver, and on the other end, I heard a cold, calm voice. "Hello, Victor. You've figured it out, haven't you?" he said, and his voice had an unmistakable confidence. It was Dmitri. "You thought I wouldn't find you?" I replied, gripping the receiver tightly. "This is just the beginning. I'm coming for you." "You don't understand what you've touched," he said, and I felt his words seep into my consciousness. "You think you control everything, but you're wrong. You don't know who you're dealing with. We don't play your games. You're just a pawn." I was silent, listening to his words, but the feeling that I was on the right path didn't leave me. Dmitri was part of something much more serious than just revenge for infidelity. I didn't know exactly what, but I would find out. I hung up the phone and gathered myself. The decision was made. I couldn't sit and wait anymore. The revenge I was seeking was just part of the plan. I had to destroy an entire system, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. They would come after me, but I was ready. I headed to the garage where my car was kept. Taking my weapon and everything I needed, I drove towards the abandoned factory, where, according to my sources, Dmitri often went. The place was poorly lit, old, and dangerous, perfect for starting a real bloodbath. My fingers confidently gripped the wheel. Inside, everything was boiling, but I kept myself in check. All I had to do was find Dmitri and make him pay. But the farther I drove, The more I realized this would not be just a fight with one person. This was going to be a war with a system that hid behind people like Dmitri. When I arrived at the factory, everything was as usual, complete silence and darkness. But I knew something was hidden here. I quickly checked my weapon and got out of the car. Every movement was calculated, every decision thought out. I moved like a masterpiece of military strategy aimed at destroying the enemy. Suddenly, two men emerged from the shadows. They approached me quickly, holding weapons in their hands. I didn't even have time to realize how they got so close when one of them shot me in the chest. I felt the bullet pierce me, but the adrenaline exploded in my body instantly. I reacted instinctively, yanked out my knife, and in one motion drove it into the attacker's stomach. The second man tried to draw his gun, but I was faster. Slashing his arm, I was next to him and knocked the weapon out of his hand. He fell to the ground, and I immediately switched to attack mode. There was no time for pain in my chest, no strength to stop. Every step was calculated. I didn't feel the pain, didn't notice how the blood flowed down me. All my thoughts were on revenge, on what I had to do. I moved forward, avoiding potential ambushes and traps. I reached the center of the factory, where I came across a group of people guarding the entrance. They were all armed, and I realized they had been waiting for me. It was a trap, but I was ready. I threw the grenade, and the explosion stunned everyone around. At that moment, I was like a force of nature, ready to destroy everything in my path. The men who tried to stop me had no chance. When the smoke cleared, I found myself in front of Dmitri. He stood in the shadows, smirking, as if everything that was happening was part of a bigger plan for him. "You thought it would end here?" he said with contempt. "You don't realize who you're dealing with. You're destroying your life and your family's life. You know nothing about those behind this." I silently approached him. I knew this was not just a fight. This was war. And at that moment, I understood that the real fight starts now. Dmitri and I were equals in this world. All that was left was to see who would survive. The night swallowed everything around us. Dmitri and I stood face to face, and I felt the tension in the air, ready to explode. He knew I was here for him, and I knew he wouldn't give up without a fight. But I was ready. His gaze was cold. He felt no fear, only contempt. I could feel his confidence growing with every step he took. "You don't understand, Victor," he said, his voice low but laced with threat. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. I'm not just a businessman. I am part of a much greater power than you can imagine." I slowly stepped forward, not allowing his words to distract me. He knew I wasn't afraid of his threats. All I wanted was to bring justice. And if that meant destroying everything in my way, I would do it. "I understand, Dmitri. And I'm no longer standing on the sidelines," I replied, not hiding the determination in my voice. Suddenly, his expression changed. I noticed how he was evaluating something, as if he realized something, and his face twisted, his eyes flashing with anger. "You're an idiot, Victor. You don't understand what's happening here. You've ruined everything," he shouted, and in that moment, I felt the air around us become even heavier. All I had done seemed to not matter. But then I felt the sensation of being watched. That gaze was too familiar. "You're not alone," I said, and in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a personal war with Dmitri. He was merely a part of a much more dangerous game. I turned, and then I saw him. The man in the dark suit, standing in the shadows, was familiar to me. It was John Harris, my old colleague from intelligence. We had gone through many operations together, and I had always considered him a friend. But now, standing in front of him, I couldn't believe my eyes. "John?" I barely managed to say, feeling my heart tighten in shock. His face betrayed no emotions, no regrets. He just looked at me, and in his eyes was a void I had never noticed before. "Don't believe it, Victor? You still don't understand what's really happening," said John, his voice cold as steel. "I've always been on the side of power. And if that meant betraying you, then I did it." I felt the ground slip out from under my feet. Everything I had known was a lie. John, the person I had trusted, who had been with me through the most dangerous situations, was now standing with Dmitri as an ally. You betrayed me?" I could barely contain the fury rising inside me. "You, my comrade, my team, you've been working against me all this time?" John smirked, and there was nothing human in his smile. He stepped forward, and I realized that all of this had been planned in advance. "This isn't personal, Victor," he said. "It's always been about survival. You were too idealistic, too naive. You and your family are just pawns in a bigger game. We all play our roles, and you, unfortunately, ended up on the side of those who lost." At that moment, I understood that Dmitri was not the main enemy. John, like many others, was just part of this deadly game, where everyone acted in their own self-interest, not caring about the consequences for others. I thought you were on my side, I said, but my voice no longer carried pain. There was rage now. I was ready to destroy everything in my path. John looked at me with pity, as if I were an old friend who hadn't yet understood the truth. You were weak, Victor, he said. You couldn't see who really controls this world. You thought you could do everything on your own, but you became a hindrance. And that's all I can say to you. Before he could finish, I lunged at him. I drew the knife from my belt and, without hesitation, threw it in his direction. John managed to dodge, but in the next moment, I was already beside him. We grappled, and this fight wasn't just physical. It was a fight for survival, where every blow was filled with betrayal, malice, and fury. John was strong, but I knew his weaknesses. I was faster. One hit to the stomach, and he dropped to his knees. His eyes filled with surprise, but I felt no joy or relief. Only emptiness. An emptiness that would stay with me forever. This is the end, John, I said, and the knife, tightening around his throat, swallowed his last words. At that moment, I realized that, despite the victory, I had lost more than I could have imagined. Traitors were everywhere, and now I needed to find them all, to destroy the system from within. As I stood up, I glanced at Dmitri, who stood in shock, watching what had just happened. You're alone now, Dmitri, I said. Everything you built is now destroyed, and you will pay for all your sins. He didn't answer. He just looked at me with silent condemnation, as if he already knew that I would destroy his world anyway. This was a game I couldn't lose. But when you fight against the system, you know you won't always walk away alive. I stood among the ruins, watching his dark silhouettes disappear into the darkness. Hearing Dmitri's last groan, I felt only emptiness. The system I had tried to break hadn't fallen. It was just a small part of it, and what I had done had only accelerated its momentum. Left with John, I knew it wasn't over. He was one of those who stood at the helm of the shadows, who expertly manipulated, betrayed, and controlled people but always stayed in the shadows. Today, I had taken his life. But tomorrow, someone else would come for him. Someone who wouldn't back down. Someone who would look me in the eye, and perhaps be even more dangerous. Dmitri was just a pawn. John was part of the game, but he too was just a cog in the huge machine that kept moving. And I was its enemy. I threw a glance at the remains of the factory, surrounded by shadows, and realized I needed to leave. Nothing could be returned, nothing restored. I couldn't just walk away as if nothing had happened. My life was no longer simple. I had left my friend, my family, and had become part of the dark game they had dragged me into. Sitting in the car, I felt the heavy burden fall on my shoulders. I drove home, but I didn't believe I would find peace. My body was wounded, but that was only physical pain. Everything I had been through in these days was killing me from the inside. I had killed not just my enemies. I had killed myself, and all that was left was to move forward. When I returned home, the house was quiet and empty. Liza, perhaps, was still waiting for me, but what could I tell her? She stood on the same line as me, and we both knew we couldn't go back. I was no longer the Victor she once knew. I went into the office and opened the desk drawer to find the old maps and documents I had used for my investigations. But at that moment, there was a knock at the door. I froze. This couldn't be someone random. When I opened the door, a man in black clothing stood before me. He was tall, with short light hair and cold eyes. That look I had seen before, and it was painfully familiar. I knew you wouldn't leave me alone, I said, looking at him. Hello, Victor, he said, his voice sounding like echoes from my past. I knew you would find them, but you don't know what's really happening. I stood there, not knowing what to think. This man was an old friend, James. We had served together in intelligence. His betrayal was a painful blow to me. Did you know about the game from the very beginning? I asked, not believing my ears. Yes, Victor, I was part of what you were trying to destroy, he said calmly, not moving from his spot. And I can't let you destroy it all. You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into. Everything that's happening right now is not just your revenge. You're threatening everything that stands behind this world. I stared at his face, trying to understand where he had been all this time. Where had he been when I risked everything for justice? Where had he been when I fought for my people? Now, he stood in front of me as an enemy, and that hurt more than all my wounds. Why are you here? I didn't hide the fury in my voice. Because you're in the way, Victor, he said, and there was a coldness in his eyes that I couldn't handle. You don't understand. The people you're fighting, they're not just businessmen. They control everything, from corporations to governments. This is not just a game. This is a system. And if you want to survive, you need to become part of this system. Otherwise, you'll become its victim. I felt my hands start to shake. He was right. The system was so deep that I couldn't just take it down. I could destroy individual people, but they would always be replaced by others. It was like an endless cycle, and I was just a player. I clenched my fists, trying to control myself. Do you want me to give up? I asked. No, Victor. You've already made your choice, John replied. But now you need to understand that you're not alone. You'll be in this to the end. And you have two options. Either you become part of their game and play by their rules, or you die. There was no threat in his words, just cold truth. And despite all my fury, I knew he was speaking the truth. Everything I had done had only led me to one thing. Either I became part of them, or I would destroy myself. I was silent, not knowing what to do. The revenge I sought was a false goal. I was already part of the game, and now I had to decide which path to take. John's words echoed in my head, not letting me rest. He was right. I had already been drawn into a system that wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. But I couldn't just give up. I couldn't allow myself to become part of their game. I had already lost too much to leave everything halfway. In my mind, there was only one thing: revenge. I couldn't leave them alive. They had betrayed me, my family, my country. And if I stayed alive, I would destroy them all, even if it meant my own death. But John was right in another way. If I didn't act quickly, if I didn't escape from them, they would destroy me. I couldn't afford to be caught in their net. And now they were hunting me. I got back in the car and drove off, leaving John behind. My thoughts were tangled, but there was one clear realization. I was no longer the man who could calmly look in the mirror and think everything would be fine. Now, every move could be fatal. When I reached my old safe house, I realized I couldn't trust anyone. All my old connections were under threat. Every step brought me closer to death, and I knew these people wouldn't stop until they reached me. I connected to the old network, using secure channels to get information about what was happening behind my back. My heart tightened when I saw the new data. They were onto me. They were watching my every move. They knew where I was and what I was doing. In that moment, I realized I needed to disappear. My family was in danger. Liza, my son, they were their targets. And I was the one who had led them into this nightmare. I tore my eyes away from the screen, and something inside me snapped. I could no longer be the one who fades into the shadows. I had to fight. Fight against them, fight against their system. And I couldn't leave any witnesses alive. I clenched my fists, and each strike felt like an awakening. I had to strike first. At that moment, I decided I needed to meet them. It didn't matter what they were planning. I was ready, and if I had to kill them, I would do it. They left me no choice. I drove to the place I didn't want to return to. The place where my battle began, the abandoned factory. Now it wasn't just a place, it was a symbol of their power, and I had to destroy it. When I approached the entrance, I saw them. Dmitri and his men. John was somewhere nearby. They didn't know I was already here. This was my chance. I pulled out my gun, and my heart raced again. In one swift movement, I entered the building. I had a few seconds to take them all down. The first thing I noticed was the guard at the entrance. He didn't even have time to raise his weapon before I shot him in the head. His body fell, and I quickly disappeared into the shadows. The rest was like a nightmare. They tried to react, but I already knew where they were. I took them down one by one, without mercy, without stopping. Each shot was like a hammer strike to their system. They tried to draw their weapons, block the exits, but it was useless. I wasn't the kind of man who fears death. I was the one who brought it, and I was ready for brutality. You still don't get it, Victor, that it's over, said a voice behind me. I quickly turned around and saw John. His eyes were filled with cynicism, and he was holding a gun pointed at me. He wasn't as far away as I thought, but in his gaze, I saw not fear, but fatigue. He knew I wouldn't stop, and that I couldn't turn back. You've lost, John. You've always been weak, I said, and shot him in the shoulder. He staggered, but didn't fall. He held back the pain and stood up again. His gaze became even more intense. You don't understand, Victor, he said, wiping blood from his shoulder. You're playing their game. You won't win. I'm not playing, John, I replied. You were a puppet. Now you're a corpse. I stepped toward him, and a shadow of fear appeared on his face as he realized I wasn't joking. But it was already too late. I lunged forward, and at the last moment, When his fingers were trying to pull the trigger, I grabbed his hand and ripped the weapon from him. He tried to resist, but I broke his wrist. The gun slipped free, and I drove the knife into his stomach. "This is for betrayal," I said, watching him fall. His eyes closed, and his body froze. I was resolute. He had been part of the system, and now it was gone. Dmitri was left alone. I quickly jumped at him and pressed him to the wall while his men fell around us. "Did you really think you would win?" I said, my voice full of rage. He tried to scream, but I silenced him. His face changed when he realized that I wasn't just seeking revenge. I was ready to destroy his world. He looked me in the eye and quietly said, "You won't win, Victor. You don't understand what you've done. You're playing a war, and you'll lose." I didn't answer. I just shot him in the head, and his body collapsed. When I left the factory and only ruins stood before me, I realized that this game wasn't over. I had destroyed the system, but they would find someone else to rebuild it. And I would fight, because I could no longer stop. Almost everything was finished. I stood among the rubble, amid the destruction I had left behind. My revenge had been ruthless and swift. I destroyed those who betrayed me, destroyed those who tried to break me. I tore apart their world, but as I understood, nothing was final. The war I had gotten into was just beginning. I sighed, lowering my weapon. My fingers continued to tremble from the strain. I was ready for any turn of events, but at that moment, all I needed was one thing: time to catch my breath before taking the next step. Far beyond this building, I knew something more serious awaited me, but I wasn't given any time to rest. They came after me again. They were smarter. They had deceived me. As I was leaving the abandoned factory, I held the phones and laptops of the people who had died in my hands. I thought I could hack into their data and find answers. But I was wrong. My phone, the one I had protected so carefully, suddenly rang. I pulled it out of my pocket, and on the screen was a number I didn't recognize. The seconds stretched on like an eternity. I already knew this call wouldn't be simple. "Victor, you've done well," a voice said from the other end of the line. It was a voice I hadn't expected to hear. I froze. The voice was familiar, but so familiar that I stood still as if the ground had been ripped from beneath me. "It's you." I barely managed to speak these words. My mind couldn't process the reality. I felt the coldness crawling down to my bones. It was Stephen, my old partner, the one I had worked with before this nightmare started. Stephen, the one who trusted me, the one who had been with me in the darkest moments. I had been sure he had died in one of our operations. But his voice was here, in my head, a reminder of that shadow that had been haunting me from the very beginning. "You thought you won, Victor?" Stephen said, his voice cold and detached. "You were naive. I saw everything. You were just a pawn in our game. And now, after you've destroyed everyone who was close to you, you're alone. That was your mistake." My heart sank. Stephen wasn't just an ally. He was part of the system, part of those I had considered my friends. Everything I had done had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. You were with them all this time?" I couldn't believe my own words. Stephen chuckled on the other end of the line. "You don't understand, Victor. We were all in the game. But you thought for too long that you could play by your own rules. You broke the chain, and now you'll have to pay for it." I went silent, trying to comprehend what was happening. Something inside my head broke. I was like a puppet, and now I had been destroyed. "What do you want from me?" I tried to calm myself, but couldn't hide my fury. "I want you to understand how wrong you were," Stephen replied. "You thought you could change everything, but you've become part of the same system that swallowed you. Now, Victor, you have to pay for your mistakes. You and your family." Like a lightning bolt blinding me, I realized what he was saying. He knew about Liza, about my son. He knew every step I had taken. He wasn't just part of the system. He was its head. "You won't let me live, will you?" I clenched, feeling the pain. "You don't understand, Victor. You're already dead. You just don't know when and how it will happen," Stephen said, and I felt an empty shadow engulf me. He hung up, and I realized that now I had to take one last step. But at that moment, I felt something cold and cruel invade my body. I looked around and realized I wasn't alone. They had come. I heard footsteps as people in black began to surround me. My heart raced, but I was ready. But then I realized I had walked into a trap. From around the corner appeared Liza, her face twisted with fear. She was with them. She had been part of this game too. "Liza, you..." I couldn't believe my eyes. She silently walked toward me, and her gaze was full of despair. She had been with them from the very beginning. She had betrayed me. She was the one who led me to this moment. Forgive me, Victor. Her voice was barely audible. I didn't know it would go this far. But I already knew that she couldn't be the one I had thought she was. She didn't just betray me. She betrayed us all. The system couldn't be defeated, and now I had become part of it. I made my choice, and the consequences of that choice were inevitable. I was caught in a trap with no way out. But I still didn't give up. I pulled out my weapon and shot the first one. Something cracked in his body, and he fell, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. I was surrounded. I won't give up, I said, realizing that there was no other way for me. I couldn't allow myself to break. My revenge was not over, and I was going to see it through to the end. But at that moment, I felt a strike in my back. The one I hadn't expected. James, the same man who had once been my close friend, appeared from the shadows and stabbed me with a knife. He smiled, and in his eyes was victory. But I knew I could still fight. I couldn't give up. I was ready to fight until the end. I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel anything. The moment James stabbed me, everything inside me collapsed, but I couldn't stop. This wasn't just revenge. It was a judgment I had passed on myself. Now I wasn't just a killer. I was a cruel judge. I collapsed to my knees, feeling the pain pierce through my body, but all I knew was that I couldn't let them win. This was a game, and I was its last player. I wasn't going to lose. I pulled the knife from my body and stood up, despite the dizziness and pain. James stood before me with a satisfied smile, watching as I struggled to regain my balance. Did you think you could do everything right? His voice was full of contempt. He was so close that I could hear his breath, feel his confidence in his victory. You were a toy, Victor. A toy in the hands of the system. You were nothing but a pawn. I clenched the knife in my hands and, without saying a word, rushed at him. He tried to dodge, but I was faster. A swift motion, and the knife entered his body again, leaving behind a trail of blood as a symbol of final retribution. He fell to his knees, his hand weakly reaching for the wound, and his face reflected the fear I had never seen before. He was no longer the one in command. He had become the victim. I stood before him, my eyes burning like fire. You're not getting out of here alive, James, I said, not hiding my contempt. He was nothing to me, nothing but a toy. His life was as useless as his betrayal. You deserve only death. I struck him with the knife again. This time, in the chest, directly to the heart. His eyes widened in pain, but there were no tears. He was too proud to cry, too self-assured to admit his mistake. But it didn't matter. He didn't know that now his death would be my victory. But I wasn't done yet. I turned to Dmitri, who was off to the side, watching everything unfold. His face showed no fear, only anger. He was still alive, but there was only bitterness in his eyes when he realized he was not going to win. You were one of them, I said, walking toward him. Dmitri didn't retreat, didn't try to run. He knew this was the end, and perhaps he already realized that death was unavoidable. You're just another pawn. You were needed only so I could become who I am. He was silent, but his face became even more twisted with pain as I approached and pulled out the second knife, making his movement the last. You deserve what you're going to get, I said, and struck. His body froze as the knife went through his chest, severing his life force, leaving him breathless. He collapsed to the floor like a sack, and I knew it was over with him. But this wasn't just death. This was cruel retribution for all his crimes, for his manipulations, for his role in destroying everything that mattered to me. Only the pleas of those who survived remained. I heard them. They fell to their knees, begging me not to kill them, trying to plead for forgiveness. They spoke to me with pity, with requests to let them live, but I couldn't believe a single word from them. Their words were empty. Please, don't kill us. One of the guards cried, looking at me in horror. We didn't know it would go this far. We were just following orders. Please, Victor, please, let us live, sobbed another, clutching his hands to his chest. I couldn't stop. They were part of this system, part of what I was destroying, and their pleas couldn't stop me. With every strike, with every scream, their bodies grew weaker. They fell, their lives slipping away like shadows, vanishing in an instant. And when it was all silent, I stood alone among their bodies, amid the ruins, feeling neither joy nor pain. I was empty inside. These people, these traitors, had been destroyed. I had won, but what had I won? I looked at the blood covering my hands and realized that there was no end to this endless game of revenge. Each step forward took me deeper into the maze of cruelty, from which there was no way back. But something inside me told me there was still a chance to escape. I was still alive. The silence after all the screams and fighting was almost unbearable. I stood among their bodies, among those who were traitors, those who tried to use me, deceive me. I was surrounded by the destruction I had created. The blood mixed with the dust, and my gaze, tired and foggy, was fixed on one spot, on myself. But now, with the entire system I had fought for destroyed, I understood. I had done it. I was in this maze, and now, with the last enemy fallen, I felt the fear that had tormented me slowly fade away. Revenge had been fulfilled, but not the way I expected. Everything I had lost had become part of me, like a heavy burden that no longer felt so heavy. My life was no longer the same, but I was no longer the toy others used. I was free. Liza, everything I had gone through wouldn't have been possible without her. But she wasn't to blame. It wasn't her decision. It was the decision I made, not realizing it. When I brought her into this world, this dangerous world where I was forced to fight for my life. And all I could do was let her go, leave her in peace, give her a chance at a new life. I couldn't forgive her for everything she did, but I could leave her to live without the fear that she would become part of this hell. I still remembered her face when she looked at me for the last time, her tears and pain. But I knew that even though she made her choice, I couldn't make her be part of this world. I gave her freedom. Let her be happy if she deserves it. I returned home, to the house that once was my refuge. But now, it wasn't the same as I remembered it. I sighed as I opened the door. Everything was empty. All that remained of what once was my world was memories. Sitting in the chair, I reflected on everything I had been through. I could end this path and leave, but now I knew I made the right choice. My life hadn't been simple, but now I was free. I had won, and that was all that mattered. I took my phone, looked at the screen, and sent one message. Simply, I did it, and pressed send. No one could control me anymore. As I looked out the window at the darkening sky, I felt all that weight I had carried for so long disappear. The revenge was over. But now I was ready to start a new path, a path without fear, without pain. I had done what needed to be done, and now, despite everything, I was ready to let go of my past life. The end. Justice had been restored, and I was free.